Welcome to the Capitals Uncovered, the Pelle and Martin Seif show. We cover investigative stories and geopolitics seen from both perspectives, both from a Washington and a European perspective. And of course, King Charles was in Washington last week, and a lot of people felt that he'd done a good job. He was lecturing the Americans and reminding them of the Magna Carta and the constitutional and giving sort of subtle jabs at the president, and generally walking away with his head held high. But of course, those of us who've been investigating Charles know that there's a deep penumbra of shady things that he's been involved with. And to discuss one of the things that might lead down the Charles route, we've got Tony Gosling with us, who's a former BBC journalist, a very, very well, perhaps the best known British sort of alternative media investigative journalist. I've been following his stuff for years. And he lives in Bristol and has been writing about the dark side and seamier side of British politics for a very long time. And I think what we're going to talk about today is Jill Dando, and that might lead to King Charles. Jill Dando was a sort of very, clean, girl next door looking type presenter of the BBC in the 1980s and 1990s. She was in her 30s, I think single, living in Fulham. Very popular. I think she did travel programs, but she also did sort of BBC News, and she was on the rise. And then she was suddenly killed on the doorstep of her Fulham home. And the blame, I think a guy called Barry George was convicted, a guy with psychiatric problems. And that seemed to be that. But it's Tony's been investigating this for years. And it seems there's a much darker side to it, because she might actually have been investigating shenanigans at her employer, the BBC, involving child abuse, sex with minors, paedophilia, and the rest of it, which goes right to the heart of the dark side of the British establishment. And that the killer wasn't Barry George at all, but maybe someone else. And so poor old Barry George was actually jailed for something he didn't do. And now he's being welcome to the show, Tony. Unfortunately, you can't be with us on video today, but that's fine. You've been investigating the story for a long time, and you've just said that Barry George is being wanted by the British police again. Well, tell us the whole story and the way you see it. Give us a tour d'horizon.
Well, okay, so yeah, well, thanks very much for asking me. The nub of all this, I think, is that if anyone scratches the surface of this story, it's immediately obvious that Barry George didn't do anything. I mean, the guy's educationally subnormal. The police said he used an adapted starting pistol to kill her. These are all just very thin fabrications. So the question for me right immediately was, who really did it? Because this is clearly a fit up by the Met. It suggests that whoever did kill Jill's got some pretty good establishment connections. But let's look at the context of who she was. You're right. I mean, about her being very sort of clean lady, very genuine on-screen presence. This was the sort of thing that the BBC used to do in say the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. But in the 90s, there was a kind of clear out going on of anybody, I think, with really genuine integrity on screen. Now, why exactly that was while I was working there, and I saw it happening around me. I saw good people being moved into off-air jobs. I saw loads of nepotism. I saw Zionist executive producers being brought in for no apparent reason out of the commercial sector that wasn't actually journalism related, and then having power over individual reporters. So this was what was going on in the 1990s. So in a way, Jill's death in 1999 is a sort of culmination of a decade of big changes. If you think about what the BBC was doing in the early 90s, the Crimewatch series in 92 did a three-part series with Alan Frankovich, the American Peruvian documentary maker that went to the famous LA Film School. called Operation Gladio. Operation Gladio looked at NATO's killing of Europeans right across the continent, mainly in Italy, Belgium, etc., in order to try and blame it on left groups like the Red Brigades, left-leaning groups, and employing fascists to do so. So this is the sort of thing that BBC was doing in the early 90s. By the end of the 90s, anyone doing anything really useful, including me, I hope, I imagine, had been cleared out. So that's the context. Jill was a Christian. She was a regular churchgoer, and she was working on a very important series, Crimewatch, which was live. It was, largely unscripted. They'd have detectives in. They'd have people who were involved in specific, fairly high-profile crimes, and we don't really see anything like it anymore on the TV, where you've got, almost like live investigations where the police are really looking. Does anyone know anything about this? What we see now is these days is often is even in the biggest sort of most high-profile crimes like 7/7 London bombing, for example, people reporting that no police have been round to interview anybody in an area where, say, for example, one of the bombers is alleged to come from, where one of the suspects lives, etc. No police have arrived at all, because we did this ourselves. We went to one of the areas, we knocked on doors and said, "Well, you're the first." They said, "Well, you're the first people that have ever come and asked." So we've seen a big change in policing. We've seen a big change in media, and Jill was really at the centre of that. The most damning evidence, I think, really is the other colleagues of hers who were approached, not by the police but by other journalists, were saying that Jill had a list of paedophiles to begin with at the BBC, and then because she was being given this list by people and she was compiling it, and so not to necessarily use on the program, but because that was part of her role as a TV reporter presenter on Crimewatch, and so this list apparently spread a little away from the BBC, but she was focusing on a handful of specific individuals at the BBC who either were or were very much acting in support of paedophiles. And of course, she's not a detective. She hasn't got the skills, the time to go into all the evidence and interview people and potentially prosecute them. So she was making a list of bits of evidence and names for the police. And she had what we've heard, and I say we, which is just journalists generally. I interviewed Don Hale specifically about all this, that she had handed this list to Sir Paul Condon, who was Met Commissioner at the time. And within a couple of months, she'd been shot dead outside her door. So there's obviously another potential cause for her killing. So that hopefully gives you most of the context, because the trouble is there is loads of things have come out since the assassination. I would call it almost a political killing, really, of Jill. And there's who killed Jill Dando, the documentary, whatever, and very little of the really hard, solid evidence has been included in these documentaries. So there've been people who are professional journalists. I know a lot of people like this, I'm afraid, who would much rather go for a nice, safe, and easy course that they're given by an editor than actually do any real investigative journalism and courageous investigative journalism, the sort of stuff that we used to see our broadcasters do all the time. And I think if anybody is really looking into this, whether they're officially as a detective or just as a journalist or a social media influencer or anybody, they will find that there's a lot, in the official documentaries that have been made about Jill that just doesn't make sense, doesn't add up. And I would say the same sort of thing is true for the assassination of JFK, where if you start really looking into JFK, you'll find, gosh, the Chicago Mafia were involved, Charles Nicoletti, Johnny Roselli, James Files, who were all brought down to Dallas for the event. And the Central Intelligence Agency was involved as well. So you start to really look as as a serious journalist at these, you'll find that the mainstream media is mainly, and in fact, quite a lot of the alternative media has thrown up all sorts of rabbit holes and tangents to go down. And they're not really getting, I don't think, to the nub of the issue, which of course is the core of the establishment, whether it's the JFK or Jill Dando. The core of the establishment is the criminal justice system, Scotland Yard, the BBC, and of course the City of London establishment, which basically runs things from behind the scenes.
Tony, I mean, thank you. That's an incredible lay of the land that you've sketched out. And I remember that 1992 Gladio program. I mean, it's still people are still on YouTube. A lot of people in Europe. I mean, there was that Swiss researcher. His name is just escaping me for the moment.
Daniele Danford.
Yeah, that's right. And that book, because it launched, I mean, here I am in Sweden, that documentary that you mentioned 35 years ago, is still referenced as classic BBC, really holding the powers to account. I mean, it was a breakthrough, a knockout. But what you're saying is through the 1990s, that kind of investigative journalism faded away, became constrained and weakened. And in a way, Jill Dando represented the last of the old school, of a kind of journalist who's really looking for the truth. And she died for it. And I mean, how many journalists are not thinking, as you said, going through their minds, well, maybe Jill Dando was killed because she was digging around and things. Well, I'm just going to have a glass of wine and look forward to my pension, and maybe we won't go down that rabbit hole or dig. And of course, it's ironic because the British never stop beating their chest about how free they are compared to certain authoritarian countries where the authorities kill their journalists, which is a chilling effect on free speech. True, that may be, but Britain is not immune to that themselves. The British are not immune to that themselves. And I'd always, I mean, I'm a sort of guy who doesn't take mainstream narratives at face value at all. But somehow, you know how it is. You walk to the front door and then it comes in through the back door. I thought, well, maybe Jill. I didn't think much about Jill Dando, but in as much that I did think about her, I remember I was living in the UK at the time. I just remember, oh well, she was killed by a lunatic. But you've convinced me to look into this properly, and maybe we can have a repeated show with you. Sorry, Martin, you wanted to say something?
No, just again, enormous appreciation for your work, Tony. It's an honor to connect after admiring your work for so long, and I simply want to add more names to this because I don't believe that per Jill Dando's murder, assassination, which it really was simply a one-off. Just as you point out, and as Pelle has just pointed out, we had a case in Northern Ireland 7 years ago. The finest investigative journalist in Ireland, again, a young lady. She was gay. She wasn't actively Christian. She was pretty much lapsed Catholic. Lara McKee, and she is shot dead supposedly by a random bullet when she's covering a very low-key riot in Derry City. I have no doubt that the riot was set up through British intelligence for a bunch of stupid thugs who thought they were working for a Republican extreme movement, who were being manipulated. But the pattern is very clear that she was actually executed at point blank range, just the way Robert F. Kennedy was, not by Sirhan, but by a professional hitman. The pattern is exactly the same. And what was Lara McKee looking into? The same thing Jill Dando was looking into. The abuse by the wealthy, powerful elite of Britain, including the top aristocracy and top politicians, of innocent young boys who were being sexually abused and murdered back in the 1970s and 80s in the Kincora case. And of course, since then, Chris Moore has come out with a major book a number of years on this subject. My own friend, Martin Dillon, one of the very finest investigative reporters in the history of the Irish Troubles over the last 30 years, discusses this in his book, The Dirty War, which again came out decades ago. And there is a veil of silence over all of this. There is a veil of silence over Chris Moore. There is a veil of silence over poor Lara McKee, who was martyred for the truth. And of course, Republican Irish were again conveniently blamed. And there is a veil of silence. I mean, you didn't mention people, and of course, we know about, there are very well-known people who are involved here. Sir Jimmy Savile, who Queen Elizabeth thought so much of. that she knighted the poisonous spider, who we now know to have been a rapacious sexual predator of young children. And he was shameless. And there was Rolf Harris, who I remember as a kid in the 1960s and 70s. There was nobody supposedly more wholesome than Australian Rolf Harris, singing and smiling behind his nice big, beware Pelle, he had a nice beard and a pair of glasses he could pass for you. You might want to take up a different
I remember him, yeah.
Exactly. But what we now know is we're talking about evil incarnate with these people. And the most influential astronomer, and he was a fake, in Britain, Patrick Moore, a real creep who came up with the most ludicrous stories to explain why there were never any girlfriends. There were never. He wasn't self-respecting gay either. I mean, because of Britain's barbaric repression of regular gay people for 100 years in the criminal justice system until Roy Jenkins rightly rolled back the law in the 1960s. These paedophiles could hide under disguise because regular gay people were breaking the law too, and they had this cover. After regular gay, well, how would one put it? Not just homosexual, but interactive sex with one's own sex was legalized in the 1960s. They didn't have that cover anymore. They needed different covers. And the BBC is at the heart of this dark culture. We know about the Mountbattens. The internet is actually full of their stuff for anybody who looks. Hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions, read the stuff. I think even in Britain, a few people read the stuff. But in 1986, the great comic book writer and creator Alan Moore popularizes in the early 1980s in his classic V for Vendetta serial the idea that there is sexual corruption and abuse of children carried out by archbishops and government ministers and deep state police officers and what have you. And it's done in a fictional form, but in a very credible form. But Alan Moore presents in V for Vendetta a vision of a state that is so corrupt that there has to be a revolution a terrible revolution to overthrow it. No, I'm not advocating revolution. I never have in my life, and I'm not now. But this is the reality that needs to be uncovered. So I think, again, you're right on the money here. And, you know, I only knew Jill Dando from a distance, watching her briefly on television again, and she struck me exactly the way you and Pelle describe her. A nice girl next door. I didn't even know she was a devout Christian. Of course, she became a Christian martyr. That's really what she was, because she was a lady of principle and bravery and integrity. And you can't really, the powers that be can't allow people like that in any position of influence or power. It's much too dangerous for them.
Yeah, Tony, I mean, you're right, Nick. You're in Britain, unlike us. Where do you get the feeling that those were the names she had on it? I mean, was it that serious that she had a list of these names? Would the BBC kill one of its own?
What we've just heard is Jill's a saint. You know, this is how deep this goes. In a way, you know, maybe she'll be beatified at some point in the future. Look, the names on the list. I don't have any details about that, but just put it this way: I worked in 1992 with a young radio reporter, Liz McKean, when I was working at BBC Salem, which was a bi-media newsroom. Liz, I got friendly with because she was such a diligent and dedicated journalist. I mean, she really did take her job seriously. She worked her way up through the BBC, because she was so dedicated to her job. I mean, I was, you know, you might say, she was for a start, she was a staff journalist. I was just on the contract, so it was slightly different, you know, sort of employment arrangement. But I did get to know her. I really liked her as an individual. She worked her way up through the BBC over the decades, a couple of decades since, or a decade or so since, 2 decades, in fact, to become social affairs editor, correspondent at Newsnight. And as part of that job, she had come across the same sort of allegations about Jimmy Savile, as people like Jill Dando no doubt had. Now, these allegations had been building and circulating for many, many years, right the way back to the 1960s and 70s. And Liz, absolutely, as the diligent person she was, she'd been getting interviews with Savile's victims. And so she'd recorded a couple. Now, this is not an easy thing to do as a reporter, to get someone to go through their experience as a child, maybe from 15, 20 years ago, with an abuser like Savile. Now, it is a very, very difficult thing to do, in fact. So it was just a real testament to her ability as a journalist to do this. And she'd recorded a couple of interviews with victims, survivors of Savile. And so she then approached, this is around about, I think, 2012, the year after Savile died. And the BBC, and I would say some of the people who were responsible for this business were on that list of Jill's. I'm just speculating, but I bet they were. And so she was told by her editor at Newsnight, she'd been being told for a long time, you can't do anything while Savile's alive. Anyway, so Savile is dead. She's got these interviews with Savile's victims. So she approached the editor with the, let's get him on Newsnight tonight. And she was told, and it went through a bit of a sort of process, as it does maybe in the BBC for anything that looks a bit sensitive. And she was just told, well, we're not going to be airing this because we've got a Jimmy Savile special coming up next Christmas on the BBC. It's all been arranged, and this would rather make a mess of that. So of course she was pretty annoyed, and she had to go back. Imagine this: she had to go back to those survivors and say, "Well, I'm being told by my editor, my manager, that we can't air these interviews that I've done with you, and that's not going to happen." Of course, they're just shrugging their shoulders. Oh, yeah, told you so. The establishment's never going to allow this to happen. And so she then approached Miles Gosling, who's a freelance journalist in London, with the story, saying, "Look, they won't. I've got these interviews about Savile. We've got, this is. I think it was the tail end of 2012, and Miles touted the story around every single broadsheet in London." Then he started going to the other TV people. Then he went to Private Eye even eventually. It took over months of going around to all these people, sometimes meeting them in person, sometimes as just on the phone, chatting with editors. Because he was a well-known, a very good, a really diligent freelancer who used to get the pieces in all sorts of places, investigative normally. And he got absolutely nowhere. Except when he approached, I think it was the oldie, Richard Ingrams, I think, was running the oldie at the time, was someone who'd been booted out under the Hislop regime because he was one of the founders of Private Eye. And eventually this story went into print, and there was an explosion. I mean, this is where people may remember the immediate accusations about Savile. And journalists were phoning everybody up, each other up, going, "Well, do you know about this? Oh, I knew about it. Yes, I knew about it, but we could never talk about it." And so Liz had managed there to, with a hell of a lot of help from Miles, to finally get this out. Now, this is just how massive the establishment, powerful, and it's quite clear we do not have a free press. If individuals who may be making hardly anything in terms of cash, or it may be destroying their careers by getting a story like this out, have to go diligently for nearly a year to actually get the truth out about Savile. So that's really what I'd like to share with you. Liz died very young. I mean, she was manoeuvred off of Newsnight because of this scandal. The interviews were eventually aired, I think, by Channel 4, and then retrospectively by the BBC, or parts of them, in documentaries around that era about Savile. But she died. I mean, I don't know what on earth happened to Liz. She died very young. I think she would be in her maybe late 40s, something like that. And so maybe she was another Savile victim. because she did, I think, an amazing job, along with Miles, in actually getting the truth out. And we may be chatting away here today, still thinking Jimmy Savile was a Jim will fix it, friendly guy, if it hadn't been for these two individuals.
So in a way, she was carrying on the work that Jill Dando never had the chance to do, and maybe she was assassinated as well. You know, right?
Possibly, yeah, possibly,
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. What I'm trying to say is, it's just a tiny number of individuals whose diligent efforts and public service have managed to, make sure that we know that King Charles's best pal, Jimmy Savile, who he told to write the public relations policy for the royal family. It wasn't the Queen or anyone doing this. This is Tampon Charlie, we call him in Bristol, doing this, employing the biggest paedophile Britain has ever known, Savile, to do the job of managing the relationship between the crown and the public through the press. This is how deep this disgusting establishment has gone.
And we've got to start winding up there, so we can't launch into any big new subjects. But I was researching a little bit about Charles and the royal family. Of course, his two other mentors are Lawrence van der Post, who had similar inclinations, and Dickie Mountbatten or Mountbottom. Andrew Lowney's just come out with a biography of his King Cora activities and seducing young boys in Moroccan brothels. Sorry, Martin. Yeah.
Yes. No. King Cora is key to this. Mountbatten is key to this as well. Margaret Thatcher was who initially actually tried to expose elements of the deep state. She was all in favor of outing Anthony Blunt, who had been protected by Queen Elizabeth II, even though he'd been a communist traitor for decades in subverting British intelligence services from within on behalf of the Soviet Union. But afterwards, she was persuaded, as the saying goes. I don't think she was blackmailed. It's more likely she was love bombed. But when King Cora came along, the man who was the model for George Smiley, the beloved George Smiley, played by Alec Guinness in the Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, John le Carré novels, was in reality Sir Maurice Oldfield, who was the head of the Secret Service. And Oldfield was not just a conventional gay guy, he was a sexual predator. And investigative journalists I knew in Belfast in the 1980s were convinced that Oldfield came to Northern Ireland to do a clean-up job, to make sure that everybody who was posed a danger of blowing the whistle on the Kincora paedophile ring was quietly eliminated. And he was dying of cancer at the time, but he still did that job. But who was being protected? Mountbatten was being protected. The Prime Minister of Britain, Edward Heath, was repeatedly named in association with this. The Daily Mail openly gave its enormous readership alleged claims, because it's safe to do it in the Daily Mail because nobody believes the Daily Mail anyway. So you can actually cauterize the truth by exposing it. But because the Daily Mail did it, everybody who reads the Guard, the Daily Telegraph, is automatically inoculated by the truth. If the Daily Mail said it, it cannot be true. But these are people at the very height of British power and influence at the top of British society. And if, as you say, Tony, you can also directly, and I forgot this, you're right, of course, the king today himself, the British public, who are sheep as always, are being conditioned to be so submissive. And this is a wonderful king, and he's just come to America, and he's got Donald Trump on a leash, and he's got Congress on a leash, and he leads them all. And he's the greatest ruler we've ever had in human history, just as Queen Elizabeth II was before him. And all this infantile nonsense is gulped down via the BBC and believed, and nothing has changed.
Well, I don't think people believe it, really. I mean, lots of people do, but I think anybody. It's like, I remember I had a friend I met through the Bilderberg conferences, Manfred Petrich, he was the son of a Nazi jet engine designer from the war, who was born in Argentina, and his first job when he left school was in a Swiss bank. Manfred was very, very, very clear about these things. He said, this is for the stupid people. And, there is this understanding amongst reasonably switched on intellectual or people who are, they call them awake nowadays sometimes, but there are two levels, aren't there, of understanding. I think the many of the general public I speak to about mainstream press nowadays have either totally switched off from it because they find it so upsetting, or else they watch it much more critically than we did. Remember, you've got this thing, BBC Verify, you've got Trump going on about fake news. Back in the 1980s, journalists couldn't get work unless they were trusted and reasonably diligent in what they did. And if they made a boo-boo of some sort, major boo-boo, then that could easily be the end of their career. Nowadays, it's almost turned on its head. It's if you're good at making the boo-boos and convincing people that the truth is a lie and the lie is the truth, then you keep your job. So this is why I think the profession has been really diluted. I mean, we're still in the union, by the way, the NUJ do try to keep standards up, but it's really a losing battle, as it is right across the trade union movement. But look, you talking about King Charles over in the US, I think we really ought to pick up on the big breach of protocol, whether it was deliberate or otherwise, by Trump saying, "Oh yes, Charles supports my Iran war because he supports my war aims of stopping the Iranians doing what they are actually allowed to do under the non-proliferation treaty." And they didn't mention, of course, Israel, that's got its 200 plus nuclear weapons illegitimately and tries to pretend that it doesn't have them. So, he's Charles, what we may be about to see another escalation in this Iran war, this illegal, unprovoked Iran war. And what Charles has done, rather than trying to rein Trump in, is actually give him a pat on the back and encourage him, it seems.
And he's also encouraging very much the Ukraine war. I mean, I found a cutting from a few years ago saying that he compared Putin to Hitler. And so he seems to be much more activist than his mother. And so there was real feeling when he talked about it. So he's playing politics, I think. Well, it's bad. And just as we speak, there's a story about an Iranian striking a US warship. So we might see an escalation there. But we've got to wind up there. Okay. Tony, I just got to. I'll ask you a final question. I mean, Prince Harry is kind of leaving half in, half out of the royal family. He said his memoir, Spare, I think it's called, could have been twice as long. He said he didn't put the most sensitive things in. I'm wondering. I mean, because we had the murder of Jill Dando, and then a woman who looks surprisingly like Jill, could be confused for Jill Dando and for an outsider. Diana was killed 2 years before, and allegedly she was talking to people in the royal household who'd caught Prince Charles in flagrante delicto, and so she had various stories that she was collating against her ex-husband, maybe, and she was taping people, so maybe she was killed. And I'm wondering, do you think that Prince Harry is sitting on a couple of bombshell secrets that he is very reluctant to let out, but he might still do so and put his life in danger?
No, I've got no great hopes for Harry telling the truth on that one. I think he probably does. One of the most interesting things in his book that he came out with, his recent book, was when he was saying that both he and William were once, when they were told that the mother was dead, they thought, no, she's not dead. Because she told us that if they tell you I'm dead, that means I've probably managed to get out of the country and I'm in hiding somewhere because I know the establishment is after me and I might have to do that. So they believed for the first few days that she hadn't died at all, and that she was hiding abroad. Wow. So this was from the time. But I mean, Harry has been very well sort of spun out of the system and parked by this agent Meghan Markle, it seems to me. So the cat that put the cream has taken. But please, if you can, please do share the I think it's about 30 or 40 minutes long piece that I did back in 2019 on the 20th anniversary of Jill's murder, with the interviews with Jerry Coulter and Don Hale, because Don did the door-to-door knocking around Jill's house to get all the information for his investigation into Jill. And he did a proper investigation into it all, and he spoke to many of her BBC colleagues, as the police should have done but didn't. And the other interviewee on that is Jerry Coulter. Jerry is an engineer based up sort of Hemel Hempstead direction somewhere. I'm not sure exactly where. But Jerry had a problem with the police in Dorset, and he put up a website about all these corrupt police, Freemasons. And because someone had stolen his car, and then he saw his car the next day on a garage forecourt. Would you believe? Wow. And he realised that actually the garage owner and the deputy chief constable and a couple of superintendents were all in the same Masonic lodge. So he put up a website with their faces on and everything, and he was approached by these ex-Russian. This is in the the 2000s. He was approached by these Russian mercenaries or ex-Russian soldiers down on their luck who were living in Hungary, and so they actually emailed Jerry to say, "Would you like us to come and kill these cops for you? It will cost you this much." And so he actually flew out to Hungary to meet them, and they bragged about killing Jill. So that you've got an interview with Jerry Coulter there too.
Wow!
So I mean, it does.
We'll put it in the title underneath your name so people can see it, and we'll put it in the YouTube description box. Great. Tony, come on again next time. Thank you.
The idea is it's not some nutter from across the road. It's a contract killing, quite obviously.
Right. Absolutely. That's incredibly interesting. The darker side of Britain, and Tony, you're very well positioned, and you've given us a fantastic show. And thank you so much. Love to have you on again.